Well, today, Wednesday, is Afghan Independence Day of all days. Normally a day when there'd be large-scale national celebrations. No such grand affairs today. I think we've got some pictures we're looking at of Hamid Karzai attending some very much downscaled Independence Day celebrations. Perhaps his final attempt to appear publicly before the election takes place. But certainly the scenes that we saw here on Wednesday were nowhere near the scale that we might expect to see normally on this day of celebration. Perhaps a sign of just how insecure the situation is ahead of the poll. Now, Hamid Karzai is a man that is very well known in the United States of America. He was a darling, if you like, of the previous Bush administration, not so much as far as the Obama administration is concerned. Let's go to Washington now. Rob Reynolds is standing by with the latest on how things are looking from that side of the pond.
Thanks, Hamish. Hamid Karzai is widely expected to win, but analysts say he should not expect the same kind of U.S. backing that he enjoyed under former President George Bush. Karzai used to be America's golden boy. He was the Bush administration's choice as the country's interim leader after the invasion. But since Barack Obama took office, Washington has a whole new approach to the Afghan leader. Nick Spicer has the story.
And this evening, we welcomed the distinguished interim leader of a liberated Afghanistan, Chairman Hamid Karzai.
In 2002, George Bush presented Hamid Karzai to the American Congress as a Democratic hero. For years, the two men held video conferences twice a month. The U.S. president's loyalty to Karzai seemed unshakable.
The progress is being made, Mr. President, and we're proud of you. Proud of the work you're doing.
Then Barack Obama entered the White House. Phone calls are few and far between. The only face-to-face meeting for Karzai was organized with the leader of Pakistan.
Good afternoon, everybody.
A country for which he has often expressed mistrust.
We just finished an important trilateral meeting among the United States, Afghanistan, and Pakistan.
We're kind of resigned that Karzai will win.
This policy analyst says there's a reason for the lack of enthusiasm: widespread corruption.
Now, it's quite interesting because Karzai himself isn't being accused of being corrupt, but rather his family, members of his cabinet, governors, etc., are considered corrupt. And so his regime is considered corrupt now by the U.S. government and by other international partners.
But if the Americans feel that Karzai has gone from Democratic poster boy to being a problem child, there's disappointment on the Afghan side as well. A feeling that the U.S. dropped the ball in Afghanistan by turning its energies to the ill-fated war on Iraq, as some of Karzai's former ministers can tell you.
Afghanistan population is 5 million more than Iraq. Afghanistan was more destroyed than Iraq. Afghanistan is poorer than Iraq. But still, the attention from Afghanistan was shifted to Iraq at a time that Afghanistan needed attention.
But Afghanistan is getting American attention now, as the troops leaving Iraq deploy across the Afghan countryside. And there will be another change.
No matter who wins this election, that the U.S. government and other major partners will put pressure behind the scenes and potentially in public on all parts of his new government or a new government in Afghanistan to really end corruption, to really focus on establishing security, to protecting the population.
But putting pressure on the new president could, as in the past, backfire. There's always the risk for an Afghan leader of doing the Americans' bidding and then being seen as a foreign puppet, losing the people's allegiance and making it even harder to do the job. Nick Spicer, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Joining me now from Irvine, California to discuss President Karzai's changed relationship with Washington is Mariam Atash Nawabi. She was president of AMDI International, a consulting firm that has worked on rule of law and civil society projects in Afghanistan since 2007. Ms. Nawabi, welcome. If Karzai wins Thursday's elections, won't it be somewhat awkward for the Obama administration to continue its dealings with him, given all of this criticism over corruption, ineptitude, and so forth?
No, I think we have to take a step back and see that the process needs to go forward no matter who is elected, and that the United States has a responsibility given that it has troops and large foreign assistance programs there. that the new Afghan president, whoever that may be, needs to be the respected leader of the country, but that the U.S. needs to work with that person and the government to reduce the levels of corruption. Because there was a lack of focus on rule of law and justice in the beginning days after 9/11, there has been not a sense of accountability, and that's what has caused the Afghan people to feel that there was a divide between them and their government, and hence the Taliban took advantage of that and have been saying that, look, we can actually bring change. So I think what's important is to support the democratic process. It's a historic time for Afghanistan, for the Afghan people to vote for their leader for the next 5 years, as well as for over 420 provincial seats around the country. And no matter what the criticism has been, to identify the problems and then work towards solutions.
Now, there's been some reports out there floated out that if Karzai is elected to another term, the U.S. may try to dilute his power somewhat by pushing for some kind of chief executive officer who would actually run the government, and then the Karzai would be more or less of a figurehead. What's your take on that possibility?
I think we, from the outside observing this election, need to be careful in not kind of calling the result before it's happened. There have been 2 polls, and both have shown that Karzai does not have over 51% of the decided voters. So there's likely to be a runoff, which would take place on October 1st against him and the next person with the most number of votes, which is looking like it would be Dr. Abdullah. And depending on whoever wins the results of that election, I think the United States needs to play a supportive role and not be seen as having undue influence on the results. And unfortunately, even though the State Department has been saying that they're not supporting any one candidate in Afghanistan, the feeling on the ground from Afghans seems to be that somehow the results are being orchestrated behind the scenes. And part of that is perhaps this talk about this chief executive role, which is not right now based in the Afghan constitution. So how that role will fit in within the political framework in Afghanistan remains to be seen.
Okay.
And this plan actually has gone back a couple of years now. It's not a new plan, but how it's done and what the influence is of the U.S. in that process will definitely make a difference in the Afghan people's perception of the legitimacy of the election and the results.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Ms. Nawabi, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Now, the British government should do more to ensure UK arms exports are not being used against civilians in conflict zones. That's according to an influential group of legislators there. And we'll get more on this story now with Felicity Barr in London. Felicity, who's making this recommendation and why?
Well, Rob, the Committees on Arms Export Controls, made up of senior members of Parliament, examines government policy, and here is a look at some of its concerns. Firstly, the committee believes there must be closer scrutiny of arms exports after the British government confirmed that Israeli weapons used in the Gaza conflict almost certainly contained British-built components. It also fears that UK weapons exported to Sri Lanka during the ceasefire with the Tamil Tigers may then have been used against civilians when hostilities escalated in 2006. And there are also concerns that British arms dealers have bought old Soviet weapons and sold them on to blacklisted countries. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to the chairman of the Committees on Arms Export Controls, the Member of Parliament Roger Berry, and began by asking him why export licences were granted to sell to Sri Lanka in the first place.
Many EU countries, including the UK, did supply arms to Sri Lanka, particularly before the recent round of hostilities broke out before the end of 2006. So there was no embargo, EU or otherwise, on arms exports to Sri Lanka. However, I mean, my committee's concern, and my concern obviously, is that self-evidently Sri Lanka was a very volatile situation, and the fact of the matter is that imported arms have undoubtedly contributed to the 20,000 civilian casualties and the maiming of many other innocent people in Sri Lanka, and that's the basis of our concern.
It's interesting, isn't it, because the same EU regulations also say that arms should not be supplied to countries which violate international laws. Now, of course, that is something that Israel has been routinely accused of over the years, and particularly in the last 6 months or so following the war on Gaza. Does that mean then that the UK should ban all arms trading with Israel? If this is a country that is accused of violating international laws and the EU says you shouldn't trade arms with those countries, should the UK ban the trading of arms with Israel?
Well, I'm speaking for the committee at this point, and I mean, we recognise that the UK government's policy has been not to export any arms to Israel where there is a significant risk that they would be used in the occupied Palestinian territories. And indeed, Israel is in the top 3 countries for licence refusals by the UK. So there's a large volume of arms supplied, and there are many refusals, nevertheless. But having said that, we believe, and the government in the UK has recognised this, that during the invasion of Gaza, there is little doubt that there were some components supplied by the UK that were used by the Israeli Defence Force and the Israeli military. For example, almost certainly components were supplied to military naval vessels that were used subsequently to bombard Gaza, and that clearly is contrary to UK government policy, and it's something that we have been critical of.
Indeed. Well, it sounds like regulations right across the European Union need to be tightened. It looks like their own regulations aren't really being enforced firmly.
I think that's correct. I mean, my committee has been critical of the UK government not being sufficiently scrupulous about this, but it is well known that there are other EU countries that take a more liberal attitude in relation to arms exports to Israel.
Well, staying with the issue of arms, and Israel's President Shimon Peres says he's had a promise from Russia's Dmitry Medvedev that he would reconsider the sale of an air defence system to Iran. Russia has a contract to sell the S-300 missiles to Tehran, but says none have yet been delivered. It comes amid Israeli and US fears that the arms would be used to protect Iran's nuclear facilities. Israel has long been concerned about the Kremlin's close ties with the country. It suspects Iran is secretly developing nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, there's speculation that Russia is covering up the real story behind the ship that went missing for nearly 3 weeks, carrying 15 crew. The Russian Defence Ministry says hijackers went on board the Arctic Sea and threatened to blow it up if ransom demands weren't met. But security experts say the story may be covering up a smuggling operation of weapons or drugs.